Uh, my name is Elaine Chimino, and we started a group, a small nonprofit, a citizens grassroots group called Common Ground Rising. And we're wanting to protect our water, our air, our health, and our safety. And we have a issue coming up here with fracking coming to Sandoval County. Now, last year, it was one company who came in who put in an application to the county. It was Sandridge, and they had actually two or three sites picked out. They only went forward with one site out in Rio Rancho Estates. That was stopped, and Sandridge left the state. But now what had happened is because we didn't have an oil and gas ordinance in place, a group, ad hoc group of citizens got together to help start drafting an oil and gas ordinance. And so tonight we're going to give you presentations on the oil and gas ordinance, what could make a good oil and gas ordinance, and Bob Wessely will be speaking. We have also Jody Lynn Trujillo-Ortiz speaking on pipeline safety issues in Placitas community. And we have Peg Burrell speaking on the Too Dirty, Too Dangerous, a presentations from the Physicians for Social Responsibility. So we have a lot of information to give you tonight, and we're going to get started because Bob needs a little more time than what I allocated on the agenda, and then I'll have Jody Lynn speak, and then Peg speak. And then we can go through, and if you have some questions during, we'll take a couple of questions, but we have to keep the presentation moving. We will do a question and answer at the end as well. So if we don't get to your questions during the commenting, during the presentation, we will later. So I'm going to turn this over to Bob Wessely, and he will introduce himself and start his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you folks for being here tonight. Wanted to talk about oil and gas ordinances, what and why, and my time budget got cut in half at the last minute, so I'm going to try to talk fast. But the point is that there's a lot of detail, and I think really pointing out the kinds of detail is more important than going through each of the details. And so we might just make it within the budget.
Okay.
Cross fingers. Okay. First, I wanted to just give a personal background. I'm a physicist by education, a system engineer by profession, and I am not an attorney. And I don't mean to talk pejoratively about attorneys, but I'm going to talk about some of the legal issues, and you need to recognize that it's not coming from an attorney. And I guess the other point is the last line. I spent something like 6 or 7 years as an individual citizen working with San Miguel County and drafting their ordinance. They were very cooperative in letting citizens, what's the right word, positively help them. And so we had an unusually close relationship with the commissions and the individuals on the commissions. Developing that in Sandoval might be difficult, and I think that's something you need to be careful of, is getting to the point where the commissioners trust you. Okay? And what do I want to tell you tonight? First, what could be in an ordinance, and some of why you might want to have something in an ordinance. And that involves various pieces about the industry and about regulation. And I don't mean to tell you to what extent you want to implement these. I'm trying to point out the options that you and the commission will have. And it's up to you folks to say how much of that is appropriate in Sandoval County. You can go all the way on each of what are probably 40 details and say no regulation, slight regulation, very tight regulation. And what's appropriate for the county is something that the citizenry and the commissioners have to decide in coordination with the industry lobbyists who will surely be there. I wanted to just quickly run through what we had in San Miguel County. We put together an ordinance that we think is really good. The oil industry thinks it's really bad, but they don't think it's so bad that they chose to sue. And so now, whether that's because the price of oil tanked or whether it's because the ordinance really is good, we don't know. There's no measurable data there. But we started off with a citizen task force assigned to write the ordinance. And that was a mistake. The citizen task force was just not qualified to do that. And there are a dozen other reasons why the task force failed. But I think the biggest was it's not an amateur job. It's certainly fair for citizens to critique an ordinance, but not to be the authors. The commission asked for a strong regulatory ordinance, and we'll talk just what that means in just a little bit. They hired an expert to provide professional services. That was a good move. It took several iterations of drafts before they realized it was needed, but they eventually got to that. We went through lots of drafts and lots of public meetings, probably in the vicinity of 24 each. And the part of the problem is deciding what you want in it, and part of the problem is deciding that you've put that in well. It's very hard to get 200 pages of ordinance to have page 20 and page 75 not step on each other's toes. And so you want to have the ordinance self-consistent. And that's what took a good part of the time once they got going with somebody who knew what they were doing. And finally, to date, this is since 2014, there have been no lawsuits, no applications to drill. Prices of oil have been very low, and the county has in fact put an inspector company on contract waiting for somebody to provide an application.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you have time?
I have all the time. It's Elaine that...
Once there is an ordinance in place, does that mean that it might be so strict that no oil company would even want to apply?
That's what the oil companies have said, that it's so strict, we're not going to go in your county, okay?
Is that the objective of an ordinance?
That's a county commission choice, or citizen choice, okay? And I think you don't want to come across saying you're trying to prevent industry. You'll get into legal trouble, okay? But it's a judgment question. You make it tighter and tighter and tighter, and at one point or another, a judge is going to say that's effectively a ban and throw it out. So that you're tiptoeing up to the, if you want to make it strong, you're tiptoeing up to the line of making sure a judge doesn't think it's a ban.
Well, wouldn't that be all up to the inclination of the judge, whether he's on this side or that side of the fence?
How honest judges are, I'm not going to get into.
We are trying to make a strong ordinance. That's the purpose of what we're trying to do. There's been court cases where people have tried to effectively ban fracking, and they have been overturned. And so we're walking a thin line between what we can do legally and how strong we can make the ordinance. And so that's his premise here.
Yeah, hang on, don't go away. I think we're going to answer your question. Okay, some of the things just to recognize, I got to stand near the mic, to recognize near the oil and gas industry. They're just a set of facts that I think you have to have in the back of your mind. It's a complicated industry. It's very technologically complex. It's also distributed. It's not like a big box store or a cell phone tower where it's all on one plot of land. Okay, they put oil wells wherever they think there's oil, including backyards. There are national and state issues, that we don't want to deal with right now. The people who own the mineral rights get good financial rewards if drilling happens. But owning the land doesn't mean you own the mineral rights. There's another piece that you need to recognize that's been called split estate. What happens is that the surface landowner has a place to put his house, but somebody else owns the rights to any minerals, oil being a mineral in this context, that are underground. And the mineral right owner can come onto the surface land and drill as well. And the royalties to the surface landowner are zero. Okay? So you've got to be careful whether, if you own your surface and mineral rights, then you get a lot of royalties out of it. No question about it. And some places in New Mexico are the surface landowner and the mineral rights owner are the same person. A lot of places, that's not the case. And particularly in Rio Rancho estates, at least half and possibly all of the properties are split estate. And finding out if somebody has the mineral rights is really difficult. The courthouse records are terrible. So anyway, one of the things to recognize is there are impacts that are not state or federal regulated. A lot of them. We'll talk about specifics. And there's very little enforcement by the state and feds.
This is under the old EPA rules, or is it
both?
Now, is that changing now that Trump?
It's gone from being minimal regulation to less than minimal. Okay, now I'm not sure if there's a good word for less than minimal. There's been a lot of news coverage about oil and gas accidents, mistakes. They happen. The operators can, if you let them, prioritize profits over safety. And that's embedded in that is where your ordinance comes in. You want to give the industry an incentive to prioritize health and safety. Okay, and then there's another thing that's really struck me is misinformation. This industry and around it has a terrible level of misinformation from both sides. The industry distorts what they tell you, and the people who the people who are afraid of the industry provide a lot of misinformation. And it's difficult to find the balance, what's really right. But you should be taking everybody's stories, including mine, with a grain of salt. Okay? what is this person trying to push? Are they trying to prevent the industry? Okay, they're very likely going to be slanting their words in that direction. These people trying to make sure that the industry has free rein, they're going to be slanting their words. So listen skeptically. It's much more than in any other area that I've been associated with. Okay, why have an ordinance? It's not often, it's not always, but bad things do happen. And the idea of the ordinance is really to give the operators the incentive to be safe. My perception, I think a lot of people's perception, is they know how to be safe, but profits drive them to cut corners. And so what we want to do, to some level, all the way from zero to lots, is to provide them incentive to do good. Fundamentally, the county has two choices, the commission. The first one is, to what extent are they going to subsidize the industry? From little to a lot. And the other question is, to what extent are they going to try to protect the environment? Again, from a little to a lot. In San Miguel, they said, we want no subsidy at all. We want the industry to pay the direct costs and the indirect costs. The cost, for example, of more elaborate, more sophisticated emergency services, the cost of additional drug treatment, and so on. Now, do you want the taxpayers to do that, or do you want the industry to do that, or some of each? That's one of the levels of regulation that you're going to have to decide on. And I'm not trying to tell you how to decide that. Each county is going to be different. You're worried.
Yeah, I mean.
You need to keep going.
Okay, let me keep going. So anyway, the point is, they're easy questions to ask. There are a lot of details that come to get the answer. I wanted to show you this map. Was done from a NASA study just about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. And it is a map showing a satellite study of methane in the atmosphere. And you can see that there's kind of a yellowish cast running up from Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, on into Ohio and Pennsylvania. There's also a spot in California. And I think most interesting is the Four Corners spot. It was intense enough that the scientists at NASA went back to their raw data to make sure that they hadn't made a mistake. Okay, when you're talking about the ordinance, there's some assumptions or axioms that you make, and you folks, Sandoval County, need to decide if those are correct for you, okay? The one perception is that a total ban is legally iffy. It will get bounced and it's probably not worth bothering with. On the other hand, if you do nothing, there's lots of risk and undesirable consequences. So probably you're going to want some level of compromise. One of the things the state office on oil and gas is called Oil Conservation Division. And they have a lot of regulations, and the industry will tell you all about them, for what they call downhole behavior, what you do underground. You'll have this kind of casing, you'll drill crossways that way, and all that sort of stuff. Very little, there's some, but not much, about what happens on the surface. And so any surface behavior is a piece that the county has to decide, are they going to regulate or not? Depending on OCD is just about the equivalent to doing nothing. Another piece is, if the industry comes to your county, they're not going to come with a small handful of wells. They can't afford it. Okay, the infrastructure to have a well and profitably get production out of it takes lots and lots of wells, lots and lots of pipelines, compressor stations, storage facilities, lots of infrastructure, and one well can't financially justify it. So if they're going to show up, they're going to show up with many wells. And their decisions are probably going to be based on where's the oil and what's the price of oil nowadays. The regulations are relatively in the noise in the way of costs. A few more points. We talked about those. You're trying to go somewhere between too weak and too extreme. We said that before. And I think basically the point is you're going to decide what's responsible oil and gas development and then provide an incentive for that to happen. Let's skip that. That time shortage. Some legal realities. The local ordinance can't contradict state and federal ordinances, regulations, okay? But what it can do is extend them. So for example, if the federal regulation says you can't have more than 10 units per volume of a pollutant, you can make a limit of 5 units of a volume, but you can't tell somebody to go to 15. Okay, you can't contradict what they're doing, but you can be stronger. You can't be arbitrary and capricious. You can't say, I think it's a good idea to have this regulation. You have to justify them. We have a whole slide on that. And there's I think it's a Fourth Amendment, might be a Fifth Amendment, we'll tell you later, saying you can't take property without due process. And your ordinance has to account for that to make sure that the industry doesn't have a legal handle to step on your toes. Not arbitrary and capricious. What you're doing is you're building a justification tree. In a sense, it could be pictured as a house of cards. You start off with the testimony and submissions that have been given to the county. And that's part of the citizenry job to do. The county should pursue that by themselves, but they probably won't unless they're squeezed. Then, from that package of studies, reports, articles, oral testimony at commission meetings, all of that stuff, the commission makes findings. And those findings go into the ordinance. And the findings are of the flavor, we the commission recognize that oil and gas can do dangerous things. Okay? We the commission recognize that when the industry is here, they will carve a whole lot more roads. Those are the kind of things that are in the findings, and they justified by the testimony package. And then you have a requirement later in the ordinance that says you will do roads this way. You will prevent fires by this. Okay? So you have your requirement justified by the findings, in turn justified by the testimony. And what you want to do is make sure that the county does its homework to build up that justification tree. Information sources, you're not starting from nothing. There are 20 some odd, 24, 25 oil and gas ordinances around the state, some municipal, some county. Particularly Santa Fe, San Miguel, and Rio Arriba are fairly extensive. Some of the others are a page and a half or 2 pages, and they don't say a lot. And that picture on the right is a set of studies and reports and articles that were submitted to San Miguel County that they can use as part of their backup for what they're doing. They're studies of the oil and gas industry. There are about 200 articles and references to about 400 others in that package. And the same set was provided to Sandoval. Okay, did we skip something? No, okay. One of the things you want is transparency. You want the ordinance to show in writing what the application requirements are, what technical review of that application there should be, and what public involvement there should be in reviewing that application. And again, in each one of those, you can go from 0 to lots. Competence. That's something else the ordinance could require. You would think that competence is, goes without saying kind of thing, but you'd be surprised. Okay? So first, the county personnel who deal with the oil and gas industry should have some smarts, some background. And so you want qualification criteria. This guy has a bachelor's in oil and gas industry if he's going to be the oil and gas monitor. I don't know what you want to say, but you want to ensure that the county people are qualified. Don't assume they'll do that for free. So the ordinance can put requirements on the county people as well as on the industry. Okay, what about a new operator? The operator, who's going to be doing this drilling? What's his track record? Do you have the right to bounce him if his track record is bad? Does he know what he's doing? Or she? And the main point is working with oil and gas is not for amateurs. Baselines. When something goes bad, like somebody detects some benzene in the water, the first argument is, it was there all the time, so it's not our fault. Okay? And so what you want to do for each of the things you're trying to protect, and again, you've got to decide what you're going to protect. You want to have a record of, I guess they call it the status quo ante. What was it like before? And that protects the industry as well as protecting the citizenry. But you want to require that when the guy has an application, before he starts to drill, what's the water quality in the area? What's the air quality in the area? Okay, so baseline GE. Ongoing monitoring. Once you give the oil and gas industry the permit to drill, you want to make sure that bad things don't happen, or if bad things start to happen, you catch them before they become disasters. And so you need ongoing monitoring. It's sort of the equivalent of having speed limit signs on the freeway. I don't think any one of you would want speed limit signs on the freeway and no state policeman. Okay? So the monitoring is an important ingredient. The possible things you'd want to protect. That you probably could write this list as well as I could, but this is sort of a checklist of things you might want the ordinance to address. Again, each one anywhere from 0 to lots. And that map over there, I think, is particularly interesting. That's taken from a New Mexico Department of Health study of, and it's the frequency of childhood asthma hospitalizations. by county and color-coded by what fraction, so many per 100,000 people. And the red ones, you might, are, when you take the average of the red ones and the average of the light yellow ones, there's about a factor of 6 difference.
Are you saying the red ones are the worst?
Red ones are the worst, by about 6-to-1 over the light yellow being the best, and the other colors in between. The other piece I think is worth noting. That's a cross-section of a well. A whole bunch of metal pipes going down in the ground, and they pour cement around the side to seal it so that bad things can't migrate up or migrate down, for example, from way down up to the aquifers or whatever. And they have really good technology for knowing the seal against the steel is good. And best I can tell, they have no technology for knowing that the seal against the jagged ground surface is good. Okay, so that's just a piece to watch when they say, we know we can check this cement seal. Okay, can you check the cement seal against the outside, not the metal pipe? Okay, one of the pieces of the monitoring is frequent inspections. You could require the county to inspect the facilities. Again, the ordinance now is telling the county what to do. You can inspect for violations on and off site. And if you choose to, you can ask your county inspectors to check the state and federal violations and report them to the proper state and fed folks. The state folks have something like a little over 100,000 wells statewide, and they have somewhere around a dozen inspectors. So do a back of the envelope. If you figure it takes 4 hours to go out to the well, inspect it, ride back, write the report, say that takes 4 hours, you figure each well will get an inspection about once every 25 years. But this is all part of providing that incentive. You want the operators to know that they're being observed, just like you want the driver to know that there are state police around the next billboard. Totally the same logic. Okay, you want to make sure that violations are known, not buried. That's probably self-evident. And you want to impose penalties for violations. There again, that's probably self-evident, but it may not get into the ordinance if you're not watching for it. The penalties should be meaningful. Cash penalties for this industry are in my words, nonsense. The state regulation, state statute says they can't be more than $300 for a violation. Okay, the publicity probably doesn't mean much, but stopping the operation means a lot. If I, the owner of the well, have spent $15, $20 million on that well, being told I can no longer use it is something I really want to not have. So that's where you can provide an incentive that the permit needs either regular renewal or that the permit can be suspended. There are lots of ways you could handle it. But giving a permanent permit, that is I think, counterproductive. Takings, it's the Fifth Amendment, okay? That's the text from the Fifth Amendment. No taking property without due compensation. And the recent case law seems to have said that it's okay to regulate even if it diminishes the value, provided it doesn't diminish the value totally. Now, what does that mean? Attorneys have beat up on each other about it. Consensus seems to be that you can reduce the value somewhere in the vicinity of 80 to 90% and still be okay. All right, I'm not an attorney, and but it's something that will be available to sue on and for attorneys to fight about. But your ordinance needs to deal with that. San Miguel has about 8 or 10 pages talking about what they call transfer of development rights, so as to mitigate the risk of being sued for a taking. And I think I don't understand it well enough to talk about it, other than to say the attorneys seem to think that that does good. Now, there's the next piece, coverage of costs. That's an important one. How much are you going to subsidize? How much are the taxpayers going to pay? How much are the industry going to pay? Industry is used to a lot of subsidy. So when you say no subsidy, they tend to choke. But who pays for the permit reviews? Who pays for the monitoring, inspection, enforcement? Safe waste disposal. After the well is abandoned, which can happen fairly soon after it's drilled, surprisingly soon. Each well typically has a lifetime of about 1.5 years, 2 years before it's not producing as well as they would like. I think we can do it. Okay, there's accident response, impacts to surface property owners, and additional facilities that the county is going to need. Roadway maintenance, law enforcement, all that kind of stuff. Who's going to pay for it? And the ordinance people, the citizens, the commission, and the industry are going to argue to decide how much to deal with those. There are a couple other considerations. What's the applicability? Rio Arriba says their ordinance applies only to private land. Santa Fe and San Miguel says it applies to private land, state land, and federal land. The last draft of the San Miguel ordinance says it applies to only land where the mineral estate was never owned by the federal government, as well as that. So that's one sentence about page 2 of the ordinance that somebody should pay attention to. What's the coverage? And you want to consider things besides the well, the compressor stations and the pipelines and all that sort of stuff. We've got 23,000 miles of pipe and 5 inspectors for those guys. That's a federal, Department of Transportation regulates the pipes. This is just kind of a checklist I wanted you to have of the things that you consider. We've talked about virtually all of them, if not all of them. And I'm not going to go through them, but I wanted that to be available.
Yeah, we can send you, if you give us your email address, we can send you some of these slides here so that you will have them and you can check that.
Okay. So what we're trying to do in summary is to point out that there's a tricky problem that you guys and others are going to have to deal with, or should deal with. We want to point out some of the possible things you could do. Make sure that it's well thought out. In summary, I guess, the first message is that it's complicated. You're not going to write an ordinance in an hour or a week or a couple of months. If you get a good one done in 2 years, you'll be lucky. I don't believe the county staff believes that. But there's a lot of detail. I just touched on things. Plugging the loopholes. Once you have a draft of how many ever pages, are they self-consistent? Are there ways that can be worked around? You've got to go through it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure the answer is no, it can't be worked around. And I guess the last point is, it's more important to do it right than to do it quickly. With the price of oil down, you're not going to have people clamoring to drill exploratory wells here. Price of oil goes back to $80, $90, $100. You'll probably have people. There's a 1980 study, one of those studies in the loose leaves, saying that there is oil underneath the Albuquerque Basin.
And water.
And water. And the report doesn't say that because this is an oil guy. But at any rate, there is oil, and he says the only question is when it becomes economically feasible to pull it out. Okay? And so it's a real issue, but I don't think it's an urgent issue. And with that, to the extent Elaine allows, I'll stand for questions. Thank you. No questions?